I'm Mark Gardner. I'm the 2026 AIA New York, I'll be AIA New York president. Thank you for all coming. I just want to introduce the event for the night. So it'll feature architects and others in the design field that have dedicated a large part of their professional lives to ensuring neighborhood concerns are heard. We envision this event as a celebration of alternative roles by architects and allied designers that have had lasting positive impacts on our cities. So the event will include presentations by the invited speakers who will explain the importance of how community engagement is a very important part of their work. I'm going to start by introducing Eric Chu, who will give a rundown.
Thank you, Mark. My name's Eric Chu. I'm co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I want to thank the AIA New York and the Center for Architecture for supporting our committee's efforts. When I was asked to co-chair this committee a couple of years ago, the headwinds against diversity and inclusion programs were gaining traction, and they have only become more forceful. Our committee stands firm for vigilance on diversity and inclusion. And we believe that diversity and inclusion is aligned with the best that democracy can offer. Our work of our committee is twofold. One, we push to open the pathways into and through the profession at all levels to attract the best. And secondly, and equally important, as Mark stated, our committee seeks to expand the dialogue of what the practice of architecture can be. Tonight, we will feature architects and others in the design field that have dedicated their professional lives to ensuring neighborhood voices are heard. This is a celebration of these alternative roles by architects and allied designers and their lasting impact on the city. So let us celebrate their passion and belief that the design of a great city is not only for an anointed few, but is for everyone. So I will provide a brief introduction to each speaker before they speak, so I'll keep running back and forth. First speaker is Nandini Bagchi. Nandini is the principal of Bagchi Architects and an associate professor at City College. She has a depth of experience in research-based design work that centers on cultural spaces that sustain community. Nandini?
Is there a way for me to see my notes?
Oh, the notes should, oh, this is where they are.
No, they should be on the side here. And let's see, is this my slide or someone else's?
These are your slides.
Yes. I have to see my notes here. Is there some? What's this?
Just loading. Or- Let me see if I can get the.
It's okay. I'll manage. Now it's making sounds. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I know it's a very cold day outside, and it's nice and snug in here. And we're talking about engaging community. My name's Nandini Bagchi, and I'm a practitioner as well as I teach. And in a way, today's presentation will show how I segue from one to the other. I'd also like to mention that I have today in the audience Nawang Tenzing, who has been really a very instrumental partner. Nawang was a student at City College and then worked with me for 5 years, and a lot of the drawings that you see on the screen are produced by his wonderful hands. And I also want to give a shout out to BKSK, who is the architect of record for this project. And they have been as wonderful an architect of record as I could have ever hoped to have. So I was invited by Eric Chu to give this talk, and he said, I don't know if you said it, but I think you mentioned that the Hearts project would be an ideal, suitable thing. It's a short presentation. And I've been on this project for several years, almost a decade now, working with the community that wanted to see this transformed into a community center. And I'm still on it. I'm the design architect on it. We finished the design phase just about in March, April, something like that, and now it's in CDs, so it's in the hands of BKSK. Do a good job on it. I just want to step back a little bit and tell you how I came to this type of work. I was very much inspired by this shabby little building in downtown Manhattan. And it was a peace and justice center with a lot of very active and organized tenants that were working towards peace and justice. The building, as you can see, was in terrible condition, falling apart. And the owner, a nonprofit, wanted to sell the building. So everyone was all up in arms. So I really did arrive to this question of activism or community engagement through activism, and that's why I titled my lecture From Collective Action to Institution Building. So this is just how this project progressed. We had an architecture design competition with 120 entries, and me and my colleague Maureen Shea, who I collaborated with on organizing this competition, we decided to display the entries in different public institutions around this building, and also to kind of talk about this space that is disappearing, from this cultural space that's disappearing because of the values of real estate and gentrification. In trying to find these venues for the exhibit, I saw that the Lower East Side is actually a very rich place that still has a lot of what I call activist institutions, and I started to map them, and then I wrote a whole book about it. So if you're interested in the history of activism in the Lower East Side, and also these questions of real estate and value, and the 70s, and how people took matters into their own hands and created grassroots organizations, all in this manner of reclaiming space, please read the book. So from collective action to institution building, I thought I'd organize my lecture in 5 sections today. The first is reclaiming space, envisioning a future, engaging the city, designing the community center, and then institution building. So I'll just skip over this, but this is really the kind of historic precedents of homesteading, sweat equity, all these buildings converted that were being torn down and burned down, being converted into HDFCs and equity housing. So really the struggle for trying to partner with community organizations for me comes from this perspective of a just city, affordability for all. And even though my work veers towards cultural institutions, not housing is typically associated with this type of work, I believe that is kind of an important facet. How do we democratize design, and how do we participate in that idea as architects? I started to also understand the buildings from a different point of view of occupancy, and who is it that was in the kind of narrating the history of these buildings from the another side of it, rather than as the designer who's doing an analysis of a building, looking at redesigning. I thought of how people reclaim space, and I was very much influenced by the community organizers, and I wanted to be in that movement space as a designer. So that's kind of how I started to work on these projects. And through that historic telling of the story of the Lower East Side, I started to become more aware of ongoing battles for reclaiming space in the Bronx, in Queens, and the way in which people advocate, in the way in which they hold their council people responsible for, the future of their communities, for affordable space in these places. There was a lot still going on, like it was as if the 70s was still living in many places of the city. And so through this journey, I came to this building in the Lower East Side. It's the Lincoln Recovery Center. And I actually was brought to it by Michael Johnson, who's one of the founding members of South Bronx Unite, the organization that is responsible for wanting to make this building back into a community center. So it's, as you see, it's a modest building, but it has like a really deep history. First of all, it was built during the Progressive Era. It's one of those health clinics that's in every neighborhood. You probably have one in your neighborhood. And this one had undergone a very sort of radical period where the Young Lords took over. And they instituted a really very special program to cure addiction. So rather than have a methadone clinic in their neighborhood, which was about to happen, they chose Reiki and acupuncture as a kind of therapy to combat what was very prevalent in their community, substance abuse. So many years later, 2013, it functioned as this kind of center where people from all over the world would come here for this type of treatment, from Holland. Like I've met people who have known of this center they're like, oh, you're working on that building? But people in New York don't know so much about this very colorful history. Mutulu Shakur was one of the doctors in it. Anyway, I won't get into that part of the story, but it's very interesting, the history of the building. So here, what I did was, in the absence of funds or even like a very solid program or scope, I thought what better way to approach it than with my students at City College. And so I took them there and we started this studio and we started envisioning what a future for this building would look like with the community. And, we did what architects do. I took them for a site visit, but every site visit was really fueled by the people who lived there. Every site visit had people in it. It wasn't just about looking at the building or how the sun is angled and all that other metric stuff. It was really about who lives here, what do they want, and constantly them narrating their story. So it was a very powerful studio, and we spent a lot of time just going back and forth between our school and this neighborhood. And we also met with community groups such as this Community Connection for Youth, Upbeat NYC, people who were already doing like powerful work within their own communities. And the need for space was really palpable. And then just to kind of like show how enthusiastic and excited everyone was, we also had the community leaders come to our studio often, so it was a back and forth, which you wouldn't get from any other institution. Here I want to just show off a little bit and say, it's City College, public institution. We're like situated very close to this place, and I think the students that I had were very empathetic to kind of the place and the problem they were dealing with. And also the community leaders were very open to educating us about what they needed in this space. So from that point on, we designed a lot of community meetings, such as this beautiful day in the fall where we were in one of their community spaces, Brook Park, and we had our first envisioning session. That was in 2016. And again, there was a clear political agenda that there were buildings the Mott Haven neighborhood was changing rapidly, and those who had lived there forever, and had to kind of create these creative spaces out of nothing, were going to once again be pushed out or displaced from this neighborhood. So it was really a struggle for the idea of affordability for culture within their own neighborhood. Rather than concentrate on the design of a ground-up building, which was also unusual at that time in 2016, I did an adaptive reuse studio at City College. I don't think anyone was doing it at that time. It was all because, the community told me to do it. It wasn't like a brilliant thought on my part. I was like, yeah, why not? And we weren't allowed to, we couldn't get inside the building. So we had to imagine and kind of create a lot of what might be the building. We did lay our hands upon some, old DOB drawings, and that was it. But it wasn't so much about the building, therefore, it was really about the people who wanted the building and what they wanted the building to be. And it was very special because, as students, my students are still learning. They're not professionals, they're not experts. So that kind of power dynamic that comes out of some of the community engagements was very diffused. And some of the photographs that are still on South Bronx United's website of these envisionings, you cannot tell who are my students and who's the community. It was all very mashed up together. But we did have some really wonderful design fun, and we really thought of the community as designers, rather than us helping them figure out what they're doing. We were all figuring it out together. And these are just some of the ideas that came out of the studio. I mean, we didn't have much time to actually do the design project because we were so busy doing all this other stuff. But in fact, I would like to say that what we did was design, right? It was a kind of, that's what designers do, they're kind of take what is going on and imagine future things with people. So these are some of their proposals. This grand stair inside that's both public forum and performance space. This idea of wrapping the building with a new kind of skin, a new identity for the old building. These are just some of the very abstract ideas, I would say, that came out of our studio. Following this, there was so much energy around this building that South Bronx Unite, our partners on this project, were able to get a grant, a very small grant, and they hired me. I'm also, I have my own small practice, and I then hired one of the students to help me. His name's Jeremy Iannucci, and so together we put together a more kind of formalized report. And at this point, we did archival research. We got the historic drawings. It does have a kind of historic value because it's a federal era building. It's very beautifully laid out. There's a nice lobby inside. There's a grand skylight on top. It does have some distinguishing architectural features. But the program was really, it came right out of the envisioning sessions. The name HEARTS, Health, Education, Arts, color-coded here, remains to this moment in its progress, still the kind of clear vision for what the space is supposed to be. And then, a little bit of, we went through a lot of thinking. We also tried to think, well, should there be housing on top? There was enough FAR to do housing on top of this building. And everyone's like, why wouldn't you do housing? You're a community. At this point, they were forming a community land trust, So if you want affordability for your community, why would you carve out why would you carve out a floor and have a giant double-story performance space? How's that going to work? But somehow the community really stood firm in their belief as to what was really needed for them to feel like justice had been done, and they had gotten what they needed out of this building. And then they, again, this idea of reclaiming, I call this section engaging the city because, you know, when you talk of community engagement, it's as if the city is going out and they're going to engage people, but really the people are so powerful. They're engaging the city here and showing what it can be. So that's kind of what I wanted to turn around on its head, the idea of who engages what. So engaging the city, they're, you know, having this powerful performance of teaching neighborhood kids free music. That's Upbeat NYC at the festival that they hold every year now in front of the building. And then in the midst of all this festivity, there's our models. There's Jeremy on a very hot July day, you know, taking apart the model and letting people put furniture into their rooms and sort of designing, still designing. You know, it's just, it's never ending. And then the model itself becoming like a tool to engage the city. And that's another way in which, you know, the project has its own life. So rather than us as architects being there all the time, you know, we leave these pieces behind. And this is from 2018. There's a pandemic, 2022, and they're still out in the streets, you know, advocating for that building. And they also formed, on the other hand, they're also forming a community land trust, that's their board, so they're also formalizing into an institution themselves from being, you know, let's say troublemakers to becoming like people who will actually be allowed to take over this building. So the building, as I said, belongs to the health and hospitals, it still does. And following all this kind of organizing, getting support from the council people, and getting various other financial ideas in place, South Bronx Unite teamed up with Alembic, that's the developer, and created some agreement as to how they would develop the building in the event that EDC gave it to them. And in January 2023, we applied as a team for the RFP that the EDC put out. And here you see it was us, Bakchi Architects, as the design architect, and also BKSK as the architect of record. And just so you know, I'm the one who really brought your name into the picture. Like they were looking at a lot of different architects, and I was like, no, these are people we would love to work with. And I was very excited when they chose you as their final choice. And so we won the RFP. It was like a huge effort. And we then set to work. So this next part I call designing the community center. And this part is a little bit more hard to get deep into in this conversation. So I want to focus on just, you know, how the community can stay involved through such a tedious project in a way, because there were so many agencies involved. The financing is so complex, and it is, you know, there's 2 architects in the project as well. But we continued, Nawang and I, to, you know, imagine this building in all its glory. And we focused on like the kinds of details that would make it special, like the signage in front. But everything was scrutinized because, you know, we had credits from SHPO, and there's just so many layers of the kinds of criteria you have to fulfill in order to finance a building of this nature with a community partner and a developer who is mission aligned. And then simple things like we were really excited about the one piece that we're adding on the back of the building, and we wanted it to say hearts, like something very bold, but also not that, just somewhat understated, but bold at the same time. And over time, it was clear that that was not going to be the direction that was going to be taken. And we're happy with what the part two. Well, we went through numerous schemes, as you do in any project. But here, it was like there was the community, there was all the kinds of demands of the historic agency, plus there was the dynamic of the developer and the community partner, two architects. So you could just imagine, like, there's a lot going on as these decisions get made. I tried at every point to go back to the board, and also a lot of this was happening online. So unlike the kind of first part, which all happened in open spaces on beautiful days with the sun shining, most of this planning, the design actually happened over Zoom. And there was a sort of, like, I felt a little bit of a disconnect between the community partnership that had been nurtured earlier in this phase, but also it was just a more difficult phase, really, for everyone to kind of come to grips with. So these are just some of the spaces that we focused on. We chose certain moments because also the kind of occupancy, I think, is still a little bit hazy. It's being somewhat designed as core and shell. So we just focused on the moments that had a bit more of a public outer-facing character to them, such as this terrace in the back. And then also just sort of to look at the building more sectionally as a space that flows from this large theater, which is a kind of more public space within the smaller offices of the other community organizers, and this large skylight at the top. We did go through a couple of meetings with the community to review things like materials and what would the theater actually look like? Should it be this way or that way? But again, in the kind of absence at that point in time of like a more complete picture of just even the management of these spaces, it was hard to kind of design them in detail. We're hoping, we're not working on this project currently. It is in, as I said, it's in the CD phase, and BKSK is working on it more consistently. But I did wish that towards the end we would be re-brought in and be a partner on the interiors a little bit more. I love to design interiors. I am an interior architect, and that's why I love adaptive reuse projects. And I think there's a great possibility to really make the space feel whole again by going through the interior phase. And here's Nawang. So just to say that along the way, and I believe the other speakers will talk more about baking community engagement into the contract. I want to know how they do that. I, for my part, looked at my contract, and there was a lot that was said about the community engagement, but I think we literally had to do these things on our own. We would somewhat force ourselves upon the community with our models at this stage. And every time we did that, people were genuinely appreciative, and they felt they had a lot to say. But it's at that stage of the work, there's no space for that, is what we felt to some degree. So just to say that for us, the idea of building institutions ground up is a very interesting idea. Since I started that project, I've also been working with 3 other community land trusts, 2 in particular very intensely. We just submitted another REFI for a building in Queens for the Western Queens Community Land Trust. And so these partnerships are truly amazing. I have formed some really close friendships. I feel like I am part of these communities. And yeah, that's kind of where it's taken me. And this is just a final image, again, drawn by Nawang here. So this is for another publication that I'm working on right now, trying to kind of think of what all of it means together. And I'm very hopeful with our new mayor in place and the interest he's expressed in these in affordability. I hope it also trickles a little bit into affordability plus design and inclusion, of course. I like those three things to be going side by side. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you, Nadine. Our next speaker is Andrea Chine. She is the co-founder of A+A+A, and they are a recipient of the 2025 AIA New York New Practices New York Award. A+A+A is a woman-led design studio committed to making places more inclusive, collaborative, and joyful. Founded in 2018 by Andrea and her partners, Ariana Dean and Ashley Guo, A+A+A was born from the belief that the practice of architecture could amplify or should amplify unheard voices. Andrea?
There's a magic button here. If I press it, this goes down. And you'll be able to see me more. Okay. That's as slow as it goes, so it will have to be enough. Thank you, Salmata. That was really, really nice to hear about your work. It's very inspiring. I was wondering what I should name this presentation, because Eric invited us to talk about our experience too and why we do the type of work that we do. And I thought, why not thoughts on belonging? I think, I named this presentation ultimately because I think belonging is something that we all crave as humans. And I have always asked myself, can architects and architecture help in creating cities, places, and spaces where people feel like they belong more? So here I want to actually start with introducing myself as a person. I have a very long name. It's pronounced Andrea Eileen Reiko Chine Cheng. In the tradition of my place of birth, which is Lima, Peru, I have two last names, and then my parents also gave me one name for each of the cultural backgrounds that I hold within myself. So ends up being a really long name, and it can barely actually fit in my passport. Another thing I would like you to know is that I am an immigrant, and I have lived in many, many places, starting with my place of birth, which is Peru. Español es mi primer idioma, the one that I speak with my family. I also moved to Canada when I was 15, and after being in Canada, I also lived in Ottawa and Toronto, ultimately moving to New York about 10 years ago. This year is my 10-year anniversary, and I also got my green card, which is great. But the point of this is to mention that as someone that's an immigrant, I have thought a lot and I have learned a lot through the idea of what it means to assimilate and adapt to new spaces, and what it means to feel welcomed into new communities and new cities and new spaces, environments. And this has also impacted the way in which I think about my identity, right? It has made me think, okay, what hat, what mask do I put on today? Who am I today? And when I was little, I used to ask my parents, like, I hope you like my self-portrait over there. I used to ask my parents, how do I explain people in school what I am? And they used to say, well, you know, like, use the Frankenstein approach. You're like half Chinese, half Japanese. You were born in Peru, so you like, but you live in Canada right now, so you wear your Canadian jacket and you like put on your Canadian crest. And then like, if you move to, you know, the States, then you say you're a New Yorker, or like, you know, it's this like very partitioned way of identifying oneself. And I found it to be a little bit disorienting because it never allowed me to settle with a specific belonging. Over the years, I have learned to see myself a little bit more like this, which is a combination, kind of like a lava lamp of many different colors. Each color is something that I can choose to portray at certain times. And it also means that I have learned to describe myself as a complete being. I am Peruvian, I am Chinese, I am Japanese, I am Canadian, and hopefully one day I will be American. I've given myself permission to belong through this narrative. And so even to go further, and as to treat it as a superpower that I hold, and I bring that theory and thinking into the work that I do in community engagement and architecture. Okay, so that's one thought, identity. The other thought that I work around a lot is this idea of architects as connectors. And Salmata explained it so well in her presentation. She, you know, as architects, we go through really translating a lot and connecting a lot of different trades and expertise. Wear so many hats. But I like to explain it to my students and also to people that I work with through this very simple anatomical parallel. I also come from a family of scientists, so my grandma is able to understand this as well. For a really long time, medicine has been separated from Western and Eastern medicine. In Western medicine, we understand the body as parts to a whole. And in Eastern medicine, we've understood it, or for a long time, they've understood it as an interconnected infrastructural system that connects many parts. One believing in the body, one believing that's part of the whole, the other believing in the body as like a system, right? So what's in the middle? In 2018, actually, Western scientists discovered a new organ that essentially is a fluid highway connecting all organs and spanning the entire body in a more holistic way than even our arterial systems, even our blood system. In 2023, Jennifer Brandel, the organ is called the interstitium, and it connects all of our organs in a tissue. In 2023, Jennifer Brandel wrote about this in her piece, Invisible Landscapes, which is also a Radiolab episode, if you're interested and if you're a fan of a podcast, as I am, and proposed a parallel between this organ's role and the role of multidisciplinary professionals whose job titles vary from industry to industry, but who are essentially the connecting tissue between many trades. She referred to these people as interstitionaries. And I propose that as architects, we are such thing. We are interstitionaries. And of course, I had to draw it in the context of our practice, A plus A plus A. This is the systems in which we work in. We really are used to hopping between social justice organizations, looking at policies and legislation, looking at community advocacy groups, city agencies, and the built environment, and even objects. We don't necessarily see ourselves as the designers that design all these things. We see ourselves as the little people inside of the connective tissue that is swimming between all of these. And we're grabbing onto culture and cities and identity and friends and things that we care about, and we move them through all of these systems in order to ultimately create a type of architecture that fits within the middle. So yeah, A+A+A has a variety of different scale projects. From the beginning, we have questioned what is the role of community engagement through the process of our typical architecture process, right? And this is a very simplistic way in which we see it. You get a request, and then you design the project, and then you present it to the client, and then maybe there's community engagement, maybe there isn't, but ultimately you build the project, and there it is, and it, you know, what happened to the community engagement? Even through the PDC process, you're asked, actually the mandatory community engagement deliverable is to present to community and then get an approval from the community board. And then if they get back to you and they say, well, we don't like something, only if you go back and you do another community engagement or presentation. So our systems are not really, you know, specified in a way that includes a conversation with community that much. And we wanted to create our own type of process because, as you know, we write contracts before starting projects, and we wanted to understand, okay, how do we write a contract that actually takes into consideration the number of community engagement activities that we think is necessary to get at the core of understanding what people need. And so this is what we envisioned and what we work off of. We bake different types of community engagement processes. And it's really based off of this process the experience that we had building the two projects at the beginning. One of them is called Healing Spaces, which was building mobile healing structures in Brownsville in 2020 and 2021. And a program we started in 2020 and ended in 2022, which is called Assembly for Chinatown, which was about, it was a full subsidized program for outdoor dining spaces for businesses that couldn't get grants and weren't fully supported by the bids in Chinatown. The third project here I will explain in full, but I just wanted to show you these two at the beginning because they were really the start of us experimenting with how much community engagement we could do and how and what it meant to co-create in the process of community engagement. With Healing Spaces, it was a lot about working with a specific group of youth to build these mobile structures. For Assembly for Chinatown, it was about building these very reliable groups of volunteers that actually signed up through Instagram calls for volunteers. We had about 250 that would just, show up on site and help us build things. So we were really experimenting with okay, what's the willingness of, and what's the usefulness, and what's the type of feedback loop that we can really build to understand the value of community engagement in the process of doing architecture. And we landed eventually in 2023, at the end of 2023, we got invited to apply for an RFP by the Urban Design Forum's local center for an Afro-Caribbean and Latin market in Staten Island, of all places. So we went ahead and applied to it. The process was really interesting. It's very different to anything we've seen before. The RFP process actually required, there were two RFPs going out in sequence. The first one was to a call for community organizations, actually. The community organizations then were selected, and they were the ones that interviewed then the architects. So when we got shortlisted for the projects that we were applying for through the RFP, we interviewed with three community organizations, and they were the ones that actually picked us as the designers. All right, so now I'll just explain the project itself. I think it's best to kind of walk you through the whole thing because I don't see a difference between the community engagement and actually what the project is. This is the site, Tompkinsville Park. It's a pretty small commuter park in the North Shore of Staten Island, which has a sizable Afro-Caribbean and Latin community, as well as the largest Liberian population outside of Liberia. It is right across the street from Staten Island Urban Center, which is our community partner. And it's connected to a very active, though small group of small mom and pop run businesses that are always coming to all of the meetings. So it's a small footprint space, highly urban space, super rich culturally, and super small. So it's been forgotten a lot when developers look at Staten Island development. Unfortunately, the park is also the site of Eric Gartner's murder in 2014, so it had struggled to shake a reputation of crime and violence in the past years. This is what our client asked of us. Just with a little market, you must do the following. You must represent the Afro-Caribbean and Latin community in Staten Island. You must create a market for access to culturally relevant food, produce, and goods. You must create a town square for the neighborhood, change the public's perception of Tompkinsville Park, and bring more business to the area, and support small businesses. Just, just a couple of things. So we got to work, and we used the template of, the type of process that we had constructed for ourselves and tweaked it a little bit to fit within a type of community engagement process that we thought was more appropriate for the type of community that we were looking at. The first 6 to 8 months was spent on community engagement alone and discovery. This is usually the most for most projects to prioritize this much. It's unusual for most projects to prioritize this much time to community engagement versus design, but we thought it was really important. And thanks to the local center, we actually overlaid this with legal support, engineering, and the local center itself had sessions that they would hold throughout. So every time that you see actually community engagement in green, we were also meeting with legal engineering and the local center teams. Our community was quite diverse in a mixture of internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, and we did this with the help of our community liaison. We were able to really pinpoint the type of stakeholders, meaning really who were the people that we needed to engage with. So we decided that instead of just going ahead with doing active engagement, we were gonna do what we call initially passive engagement with it, which is showing up, really just showing up to all of the events that were happening in the community, meaning like Harvest Fest, meaning neighborhoods events, meaning small business networking meetings. And we would present the idea of the market every time. And we would just we would introduce ourselves as people and say, this is why we think we care about doing this project. We also, after we did passive engagement, we went on to doing active engagement, which was with our community engagement tools. We used pre-occupancy and post-occupancy surveys. Sorry about the typo. We even did a scavenger hunt to introduce youth and neighbors of the community to the history of the park, actually. And we did a bunch of introduction pamphlets that we would just post up around the neighborhood. The last one that we did was a youth workshop that became actually quite informative for us to design the structure that we eventually built to hold space for the market in the park. So out of the community engagement, we actually learned a lot of things, and these are the main things: culture, rich people living in a cultural food desert. Tompkinsville Park is an active park, and active meant safety, and we really wanted to make sure that we were holding on to that. And then the last thing was that Tompkinsville Park does not represent its community, or did not at the time that we were starting the project. Off of that, we also learned about the challenges and how we could turn those challenges into opportunities. For example, Tompkinsville Park has a bad reputation because of its history of crime and violence. However, the programming that our nonprofit had been doing in the park had increased a sense of safety already within the community. So with the project, we needed to double down on that. Ultimately, the project became a simple, small structure that would hold all of the materials, meaning furniture, tents, would also run as a ticketing booth for the market. It would be closed during the weekdays and open up during the weekends. And then during the weekdays, it could also open up to host different programming events. Our nonprofit actually partnered up with other nonprofits in the area to make up and to craft other type of programmings, including to the newly built homeless shelter for women and children in the corner of the block. In the short term, we did all of this work through the Arts in the Park permit, thinking really about the market and the structure as a one-year prototype for the market, with the pros of being, allowing us to bring in diverse groups of vendors, flexible programming, test the economics of the market, and of course, the cons being weekly permit applications, the temporary state, the fact that we need to apply for a 2-year permit for cash exchange. But we didn't take a short-term approach to the design of the building. We really designed it and built it as a robust structure that could last for many, many years. And we worked with engineers to actually do that. And a testament to how successful it has become is that our long-term goals have been able to be achieved through a conversation with the local parks commissioner. They have approved it as a permanent structure currently because it has proved to actually improve safety and make for maintenance to be easier. They don't just store things for the market, they store things for the maintenance of the park. So it has become a permanent infrastructure beyond the permitting of arts in the park. Now, I want to go a little bit backwards because I do want to show you the workshop that we did with the youth. Staten Island Urban Center has a group of about 15 to 20 kids that they work with per season. We worked with them on a envisioning session for what we were calling back then the transformer, this structure that could transform into many things. And so we asked them to make these little models. We created these templates that they could just cut out and fold. And we also gave them, have you ever made those like paper dolls where you can like put different, the concept was exactly the same. The arms and the legs of this transformer and the roof were like clothing that you could tape onto these structures. And they came up with really, really amazing ways for them to, like for the structure to work. Along with a lot of really wonderful ideas for programming. which included things like, this thing should have a charging station for my phone, or it should be a vending machine. It should have murals and art screens. It should also have, it should also be a convenience store or host music Afro-Caribbean local drill rooms or have a skate park. All of these things actually really inspired the way in which the structure is programmed now. And especially because with the help of Staten Island Urban Center, really, as the main programmers of the structure, they've been able to shape their youth program to actually be in tandem with the structure. So every time that the youth cohort is activated or comes to learn, they learn to then also set up a business in the casita. They learn to also, do a DJ session or a music festival, things like that. This is how the structure looks and how it opens and closes. We actually added in phase 2, which was 3 months after the full structure had been built, a rainwater catcher. So because there was a need for rainwater or for water access to garden, and also the community really wanted access to a pollinator garden. That's what they wanted, so we added that very easily. And then on top of that, we designed the panels that decorate the structure as a removable, interchangeable set of panels. And the idea with this, in the middle of the project was the youth really wanted to see this as an art gallery. And we said, okay, why not think about them as these panels that you can interchange per season? Maybe the panels then later gets auctioned, and then you can fundraise with the money that you auction this art from, and we can invite artists from all over the world to actually rethink, what art in this community means. The art actually gets made through a process that we've been refining in the studio, which is a paint by number relationship with artists. We bring in artists. This first season, we worked with this wonderful woman called Urechi Ogugo. She comes in, she designs a 2D mural, and then we transpose that into the larger structure, and then we assign numbers to each color. We order the colors, and then community comes in and we paint by number, literally. And on the second day, the artist comes back and does all the detailing. So the market has been then shaped around the structure. It now hosts open mics. It does salsa lessons. During the fall, it actually opens up and it becomes a pumpkin patch. And with such a little structure, we've been able to actually reinvigorate the entire park, which is really wonderful. And every single idea that was programmed into the structure, from its opening and its flexibility to the way that it could be multifaceted and contain art, really came from conversations from the community. We solely just chose the color blue and made the drawings for it. But our engagement and our work really didn't end there. We, as you saw in our process, we have this thing called project sustainability, which means we make a maintenance manual for our community, and then our clients, and we also make sure to make a impact statement report that allows them to then have conversations with parks in this instance to really try to understand what the project's impact is in terms of percentage and numbers and tangible results. The next steps is that happily we have been brought back into the community, and we're working right now with Staten Island Urban Center to expand the impact of the casita and design lighting, which is much needed currently in the park. And so we're working with them, we're working with the local center still, and Flank Collective to design something that echoes what the casita did, but in the modes of art lighting. And this is funded through SBS, through their Strategic Impact Grant. So I just wanted to end with a quote from my mentor, Sharon E. Sutton. So she said, she wrote in her book, to separate the art and science of building from the social and political context in which they occur is to further distance ourselves from those decision-making processes that do more to shape the built environment than the design of isolated objects ever can. And I really believe this, and I really hope that this lecture, this presentation, is an invitation to all of you to consider how community engagement is not just something that you check off the list, but rather an opportunity to try to figure out how, as architects, we can continue to design spaces that people really feel like they belong in. Thank you.
Very inspiring. I was just amazed at how committed you are to the notion of the community engagement to inform such a little project that has roots and tendrils and extends so deeply into the community. So I want to thank you for that. Our final speaker is Megan Marini. She is principal at 3x3. 3x3 is a groundbreaking practice of community-centered designers. Megan was trained as both as an architect and as an urban planner, and she brings to the table a perspective outside the role of the traditional architect. And I'd like to everyone give her a warm welcome to Megan.
Okay. All right, so I'm happy that there are some overlaps between the presentations. I promise you it wasn't planned like this. So I'm going to share some examples of our work that are not necessarily going deep into the projects themselves, but talking a little bit more about like methodology, approach, and then different models for engagement. So let's get started. So just by way of introductions, I am a principal at 3x3. We founded almost 15 years ago for the purpose of trying to center community voice in city-making processes. So really, we function as sort of, I like to call it the social layer in different design and planning processes. So one thing that maybe inspired this practice is some of the common pitfalls of community engagement that many of us run into, which is, we think we have an idea, we have a design plan or a proposal that we want to share with community stakeholders, and then we get their feedback, but we really try to kind of limit it to, do you want the swings to be red or blue, but don't really get to the opportunity to incorporate meaningful, substantive feedback. And a lot of this is also like structural to the points that Andrea brought up earlier. And then we design solutions that maybe aren't as impactful for communities as they could be. And sort of at best, we find that they're not really resonating with community stakeholders. They're not providing as much benefit as they could. But at worst, they are they can lead to broken trust if we fail to incorporate feedback in a meaningful way, keep communities in the loop, or even perpetuate harms. And so this led us to ask the question about how we might shift away from that model of engagement, and that means really taking a look at understanding communities not as monoliths, but as plural, recognizing all the diverse dynamics that are happening in communities and designing processes that can really try to be as representative as possible of a specific community. That means we're thinking about engagement communities as multidimensional, and we're trying to surface different lived experiences. And we're also trying to evolve our self-awareness as designers and practitioners, because we are facilitators of lived experience and knowledge, that we need to understand our own positionality and identity, again, as my co-presenters beautifully demonstrated, to understand how we can better show up in the rooms with community stakeholders. Because we might not be able to fully understand what they're sharing with us. So it's really important that we do have diverse engagement teams when we are going into community contexts. And then other questions we were asking were, how can we redistribute power through engagement processes rather than reinforce it? And how do we build towards trust and collaboration? I think a lot of times when we were entering community contexts, we found a lot of past traumas and harms, and realized that we were starting to sort of mend relationships between design and construction institutions and community stakeholders. And so that led us to a methodology we call community-centered design, which we refer to as really a practice of self-reflection, co-creation, and transformation that tries to center communities whose voices have been marginalized by the processes that impact them. There are a couple tenets of this, like nobody knows everything, but together we know a lot. Communities of people affected by a design initiative are really and should be the experts and agents of that transformation. And over time, we're kind of starting from the top here as designing with community is considerate, but where we want to go is that designing with community is just good design, and it's just part of sort of the standard practice. Community-centered design is not necessarily something we made up. It's really steeped in a lot of adjacent design practices, like liberatory design, participatory design. Again, participatory design has been practiced since the 60s. So we're building on a rich tradition here, and some would argue that it goes even further back than that. And it's importantly part of the transformative paradigm, which means that by practicing this, we can have sort of ripple effects. One thing that we also made as a decision was to not think about this as a process. And the reason being is because processes can need to be really adapted to contexts, and we didn't want to be prescriptive or rigid in terms of you need to have X number of workshops, or at this stage, even though those kind of standard operating procedures are important. But we wanted to have a set of guardrails that folks could use to sort of guide them as they went about their practice. And so this is what you see reflected here. Kind of looks like that little kid stack ring toy that you might have played with as a child. But starting from the top, starting from the bottom, what I mentioned around positionality, understanding your own identity in relation to those that you're engaging with, all the way up to the top of building access, belonging, and care. We really see this as a spectrum of reflection to action, and something that you're not necessarily starting with step 1 and moving to step 2, but you're really holding this framework as you go to help you orient yourself through the process. We wanted this to also be a part of building a community of practice. Again, we think community-centered design is for everybody, including architects, designers, but also community members. And so we have a lot of trainings that we do with our toolkit that we've developed based off of that values framework in order to help anybody who's interested in applying this to their day-to-day work think about how it applies to their context. So just to give some examples of what this looks like in practice, I'm going to share through a series of different models that we've been deploying over the years. So I'll start with, and this was one of our earlier projects that we did out in East New York, where we were working with a collective of small businesses and a local development corporation in the context of a neighborhood rezoning that was happening at the time. And the key challenge here was that small businesses were not showing up to the planning processes, largely because they are busy, they didn't have the access to the information about the planning processes, and as a result, their voices were not being included when they very much would be affected by this process that was unfolding in their neighborhood. So we went about conducting an initial sort of ecosystem mapping, talking to different stakeholders, small businesses, some of them mom and pop shops with sort of brick and mortar retail storefronts, all the way to, on the right here, somebody that had a at-home shop where she sold some of her wares, to really understand what the diversity of interests were within the small business community. And something that we heard was that there used to be a merchant alliance, but there no longer was, because the person who was the key organizer had retired and moved to Florida. So we thought there might be an opportunity here to create the seeds for another merchant alliance to help support organizing amongst this constituent group. And the way that we went about that was by identifying key trusted ambassadors. So these are small business leaders that had a lot of influence in their community to help spread the word and share information and resources. We held technical assistance workshops where we brought in zoning experts, land use planning experts, but also sort of local workforce development experts and local talent recruitment experts to help prepare the small business ambassador circle for sharing information and resources to their peers. And I'll go back a slide. We also created communication collateral about the campaign, called it We Mean Business, East New York. We did wild wheat pasting of the posters in scaffolding throughout the neighborhood, but also the idea here was they were pasted in business storefronts so that other folks could go in and ask about what the initiative was. And we are really proud that this has, what this kind of initial prototyping of a merchant alliance has turned into a formalized merchant alliance, and now they're applying to become a business improvement district in this corridor. So this is just demonstrating how bringing in ambassadors can help plant those seeds and reinforce that connective tissue of relationships at the community scale. Another model we've been bringing into our work is this idea of participatory councils. We've applied them in a couple different projects where we're looking at accessible mobility. So here we were working on the NYC ferry and performing sort of a participatory action research effort to understand what are the barriers to access for the NYC ferry service. So here you can see we recruited folks with a couple different types of disabilities, and we shadowed them as they went about a journey to understand what are the, intervention pain points and what are the possible changes that we can make in the ferry service to make it more accessible. And then not pictured here is another council that we're hosting for the city of Chicago, the Chicago Metropolitan Area Planning Association, where we're facilitating a regional council there with accessibility advocates as they're undergoing a 50-year planning process to make sure that they're consulted at every step of the way across different initiative areas ranging from housing to mobility and planning, and to some of their accessibility work at the municipal level. So that's something that we're doing on a monthly basis, and facilitating connection between different teams within the Planning Association and the advocates. The third model I'll talk about really quickly is community partnership models. And we're thinking about how these can create more equitable access to participation. Oftentimes, as designers, we don't have the relationships in every place that we work. And so that's where it's also really important, again, to work with the trust and through the trust networks. And so how can community-based organizations with those local roots become co-facilitators in the process? And so we applied this for the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway visioning in the North and South Corridor, where it was a challenge to get diverse representation in the planning process. So this helped us in working with 20 different community-based organizations expand our reach because they became co-facilitators in the process. So here's a workshop that was held in Sunset Park by Mixteca. And here are different events that were hosted by the community partners as well. And we're also wrapping up a project in Boston on their climate action plan, where we worked with 30 different community partners and actually helped to match partners together so that they could learn from each other as they were planning their events and develop relationships and seed what would be implementation of some of the strategies that were developed as part of that process. And then the last model that I'll talk about is community ownership. So you can see here we're kind of moving through these sort of like rungs of power sharing, if anybody's familiar with the Arnstein ladder of participation. And the ideal is you're moving from like tokenism and a consultative model all the way up to co-production and community ownership. And so here we're looking at how can communities really lead engagement processes, but also for assets that they can eventually own. So you might think about the community land trust model that Nandini spoke about as being an example of this. We created and launched a community ownership model for a housing portfolio in LA. This was in Echo Park, where the neighborhood was rapidly changing. And we wanted to create a model that would allow longstanding residents to benefit from some of the wealth building opportunities that comes with that change, because those were the communities that also contributed to the cultural value that made it, desirable in the first place. And so we workshopped with different community stakeholders to create a lower barrier of entry into what was a real estate investment trust vehicle. So anybody could buy a share of this for $100, which is a much lower, much less steep investment than some of the previous similar shared ownership models. But this required really building the community through the process, because it just wasn't going to work if we had proposed this and then ask people to sign on. So it had to be of and from community stakeholders. And so here we were working with a number of local community-based organizations and other local institutions to get this off the ground. And we also developed a impact report framework to keep accountability through the process from the management structure here. And where this is all laddering to is how we might, and this is sort of like a provocation, how we might embed participatory infrastructure into our neighborhoods in an ongoing way. So how do we seed it so that it is self-sustaining and lasting and doesn't necessarily require designer-led or city-led intervention. Obviously, we should be building from the existing networks here and advocacy groups. One example that we've been working with is our Sparks initiative, which is examining how parks-based programming can be a mechanism for bringing volunteers to participate in an ongoing way. And so for this effort, we seeded different design teams in neighborhood parks across New York City in order to lead the co-design process and another year long of implementation for programming that would bring people into recently renovated parks by the parks CPI program, which brings the parks to life after they've gone through some nice new interventions. And so here the question is, how do we build that sustained volunteer momentum and capacity for continued involvement, continued programming, again, after we, as designers, leave. So here's just an example of the campaign that we created, campaign materials that we created in order to get the word out, build momentum, bring people out to the parks, and really activate not just the parks, but this campaign and movement. Similar to some of my the other speakers, we think about all of this as really trying to, again, cultivate the trust networks so that we can advance belonging in the city writ large. If you are able to participate in a city-making process, it helps you feel reflected in the city. It helps you feel heard, and those things all contribute and ladder towards these feelings of belonging. The Sparks project that I mentioned before is being studied right now by CUNY, the School of Public Health, and looking at how being engaged in a community-led process can result in public health outcomes. And what we're finding is not only does it enhance social cohesion, but people are using some of those skills that they learn in those processes in other spheres of their life. So this is really helping to seed that transformation that we're really looking for by engaging people in a process and by engaging people in a way that they might not expect. And where we'd like to see the practice go is in bringing some of these new models together and thinking about engagement in different ways that we can really start to, again, reinforce that connective tissue for the city. And this connective tissue, the relationships that we build through these processes can create more resilience, right? It helps to build adaptive capacity. If we can work together better, we'll be able to solve problems together better. And so this is really, again, kind of our pitch to the incoming administration is how can we think about these systems in a more sustained, robust way instead of just one-off projects. And part of it will be looking at some of our standard processes for community engagement where it comes into play, but also in thinking about how the city's organizational DNA works in its transparency with different community groups and residents. And I will also, sorry, this slide got a little jumbled. I will also just pitch another AIA New York program. We are doing a training session on community engagement and community-centered design next week. It's on the 18th and 19th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. each day. If you're interested, come find me after, and I'm happy to share more.
So we're going to gather up in front, and we're going to have a short, moderated panel, and then open up for questions. And I really want to start with Megan, because your enthusiasm came out so wonderfully in your presentation, and also the fact that you're a planner came out, because you come from a very different perspective than what architects, what we go through all day long. We don't get to see all the things that you do, quite frankly. So I really wanted to focus first on the journey that you made from an architect's training to a planner. What made you decide that this is the thing you really wanted to do, and how does community engagement fold into that?
Yeah, I'll try to give the abridged version because it's a long story. But I was working in, actually in Haiti on a, I guess we might call it an environmental justice project now, or we might call it a supportive housing project. But we were looking at how housing can create and affect health outcomes, especially for communicable diseases. And that was me as an architect entering a social context in which I was not familiar. I did learn the language, but I realized in this process is that I felt like I was trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And the scope of work that I had been handed wasn't necessarily aligning with community needs or desires. And it got me really interested in the social layer of design practice. And that's ultimately what led me to planning school, and it really was formative in my thinking about how community stakeholders need voice in these kinds of processes.
This is a similar question for Andrea. Your personal commitment to this type of approach is so strong. Where does that drive come from?
I think it does come from my background a lot. I think that sense of wanting to be the type of architect that I wish was present in all of the cities that I lived in when I was moving throughout all of these different cities. I also had a couple of experiences working as an intern and as a young architect in cities around this, in firms around the city. And for some reason, I always ended up being the person that was put into doing the community engagement. I found myself in a lot of rooms actually with people just being angry at the design. So I would just sit there and hear their grievances. And that really made me realize that we had designed this very established process of failing the community. And so I wanted to kind of understand different ways of practicing that I wasn't seeing out there. Yeah.
It sounded like you wanted to succeed at what you, instead of failing. That's what it sounds like. And you had to reinvent to make that happen.
Not to mention, though, that I took a lot of inspiration from planning. Like those things, those processes already existed. I just wanted to understand how is it that I, as a architect, get to partake on those as well.
Yeah, and in full disclosure, I am a planner as well as an architect. So I have this kind of secret love for the things that you people are all doing. In many ways, you are my heroes. I just wanted to say that up front. So same with you, Nandini. How did this become such a personal passion?
Yeah, I think I told you a little bit about how I came to, really do what I mean, I no longer think of it so much as advocating for people, but rather being, like within that system so much. I would say in listening to the other two presentations, I'm not sure if I'm a qualified community engagement person. I don't think I did it as in, like, I didn't come to it thinking like, oh, this must be done because people need to be heard. I just sort of fell into it as an architect would, I need to do my research. This is what I'm interested in. Architecture is a political project. It's also a very expensive project. It takes a lot of people to be involved and committed to it. And specifically, if you're going to work with people who don't have those resources, then you have to like dig into it. So I don't think I have a very good like system of going about it. It just so happened that I needed that information in order to design. So it's more traditional in that sense.
I get that sense too, that you came about it very organically. But what struck me is that to fully represent your clients, you had to go this way. So, and the themes that I heard repeating over and over are the themes of trust and empowerment, that these things are not taken for granted. These things are important. So I just want to ask this question. And when you go through this process, one of the big questions I always think of is, who is representing the community? Are you the representer, or are you the gatherer? How would you answer this?
Yeah, I don't think I represent the community. I'm probably more of the gatherer. I just want to say, actually, I feel mostly like an architect, who's learning about community organizing from organizers. Because often I don't also directly work with, I don't know who the community is in like these different situations. There are different people that you're called upon to engage with. In my case, I mostly work, all the projects that I'm working on, they're with community organizers. And I just sit there and I'm like, wow, this is how they go about it. This is a skill that we should have as an architect, but it's not really highlighted in our education. So as an educator, I felt like I want to bring that to my students. And then as a practitioner, I feel that I'm constantly learning from working with some very powerful organizers. I'm lucky to be exposed to that.
I get that. And then Andrea, I really felt like you came from it a very different way, like questioned the whole model. And so you're like a fresh take is that gathering the different neighborhood groups is like step one. Maybe you can speak about how you think about community representation and how you do ensure that it is done in a way that fully represents as much as possible.
I mean, every project that we do that is a public space project that we have done community engagement on, we make sure to partner up with a community group that's already pretty well established in each community. In Chinatown, we did work through Think Chinatown as our main partner. In Brownsville, we worked with the Youth Design Center, used to be called the Brownsville Youth Center before. So I really echo what you're saying about learning from community organizers. A lot of the processes that ended up being something that we now have more or less established as a structure in the studio come from conversations that we've had with, these, I think, which are really should be called community leaders. I do think, though, as the person that gets to present to parks or DOT or, the building department. I do think that I hold some representation power, and I try to do that the most through interpretation and translation of having as many conversations as I can to try to understand really what's at the core of what I'm being asked. Like, say, for example, when I'm being told this stretch of street, it's scary, right? And I have 10 post-its that are talking about safety and scariness. I try to connect that to having a conversation as to what specifically is scary. That can be like, not necessarily, like for this project, for example, that we're working on, it's about lighting, public lighting. We went to the site and we asked, how does this space feel? And a lot of answers were, it's scary, it's not safe. But the corridor is actually very well lit. It's like extremely well lit. And what was happening is that it was lit in a way that was too much like a surveillance light. So it was creating these sharp shadows that actually made it very scary. But if you didn't like connect one with the other, you couldn't actually translate through your design knowledge, right? What was at the base of that feeling? And I like that. I think that as a designer, I tell my students, architecture school really shapes you for that, for like being creative enough to understand someone's feeling with like the built environment. And it's like, yeah.
Yeah, to really listen and engage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's both, I think. You are doing your best to translate and represent, and then you're also letting the community represent themselves through, how many engagements you do, how many conversations
The
you have.
amazing thing about you, Megan, is that one of the projects, the Brownsville project, the East New York project, was you discovered there was no real organization anymore. And you stepped up to create connective tissue. So I find that quite amazing. And on, you talked about power and trust. And basically you built this pyramid where in the end the community is fully engaged in a way that they're now engaged citizens. So.
Yeah. And I also think about it too, as how does engaging in a process from a community stakeholder perspective not only lead to you feeling belonging or feeling like you're able to shape the outcomes, but also as an experience that you can take away with you that can help serve you down the road, whether that's in your career, whether that's in your community, whether that's in your family, and just helping to be a little bit more collaborative. Because I think a lot of the times we find that there's just a lot of adversarialism. A lot of the project contexts can be very polarizing. And so what we try to do is just hold space for that conflict to emerge, because I think we're often scared of conflict. It's not always a bad thing. It's okay to let it surface, but eventually you have to work through it. And so it's like those skills of working through conflict that I think ultimately we're trying to also build with folks that are engaged in the process.
Yeah, particularly since you're involved in a lot of workshopping, you're often engaged in that kind of front end where you're gathering information, but to build trust over time requires continued involvement. So now I want to flip the script a little bit and do the criticism of the architecture profession. Oftentimes, as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, the community engagement is at a very surface level, and you don't build trust with the community by doing that. Can you speak more about the wrong way to do it and the right way to do it?
Yeah, we've done a lot of thinking about that. And, a lot of them were mistakes I made myself too, in not really honoring community representation or not going we have like the squeaky wheel problem, which is the same few folks that keep showing up to community meetings because they have time, they have resources, they have access to information. And so how do we go beyond the squeaky wheel to make sure that there is a broader community representation? And how do we also make sure that we're meeting communities where they are? And that's part of the going beyond the squeaky wheel to just make sure we're getting diverse, equitable representation in a process. And that to me is a really critical piece of that. And something we also deal with a lot is like when timelines change, the feedback loop falls short or falls flat. And so you're like, community stakeholders don't hear back, they don't know how their feedback was integrated, and that leads to broken trust. And we see that all the time.
And Nandini, you were mentioning that too during the construction process or this construction document phase. You feel like it's a challenge to maintain community involvement.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge all along. And just going back to your question about architects and community engagement, I will say that for me, I also think of architecture as an aesthetic practice. And I do have certain ways of designing. Just like when I work with rich clients and they disagree with me, I get really frustrated. And the same happens with the community clients as well. It's because I'm not just engaging to get exactly a certain kind of information from them. I'm engaging with them to design with me and, play along with me and ultimately make a beautiful project together that is meaningful. So that sort of situation remains the same. It's embedded in our DNA of how we design.
In your DNA, but it's not in every architect. Some architects just want to get the job done.
Yeah,
So
well.
What I find admirable, and particularly for Andrea, is that she bakes it into her contract. So I want you to speak about your contracts and how it differs than the standard architecture, your efforts.
Well, we have different contracts for the different types of work that we do. Obviously, our residential work or our commercial work doesn't work like that, but our more public work that we have done with community organizations, we do try to break it down in those phases that I showed, rather than SD, DD, CD. We bake it into these like larger portions, and we make it really understood that community engagement for us is something that we will be weaving through all of those. So we actually write about it in the contract, and we say, okay, so for each of these phases, we expect an engagement, and we expect to formulate that engagement or come up with what that engagement might mean through conversation with our community partner.
Does that affect your fee structure?
Yeah, yes. So that affects the fee structure. That also affects how we charge. So for these type of projects, we usually break down the fee evenly across the board. So I know that for design bid build, you usually would do percentages per phase. We don't do that. We know happily because of these projects are based on grants sometimes, or they're based on structured, pre-considered fees, that we have this much money for the build out, we have this much money for design. We break it down into basically every single phase gets the same exact fee. Therefore, the importance of the community engagement is even across all of the phases, and so one doesn't move to the next phase if that is resolved at that point.
Can I ask a question about that? So how do you ensure that the community gets paid for that time? Because like that is the big reason that you cannot have so much community engagement is like they're working with you, you know, and not getting paid for
Yeah.
it for the most part.
That's a really good question. In the past, we've done not necessarily payment, we've done exchange. So a lot of the times, the nonprofits will have extra budget to feed and provide, you know, food and drinks during the event. A lot of the other times also, say for example, with artists, which we also consider part of the community, we make sure that we are allocating their fee baked into the construction budget. We have done exchange in Assembly for Chinatown. We did exchange, so we worked with small businesses, and so if they donated something, they would get something else in return. So we've worked around different ways of payment that wasn't necessarily monetary. But you're right, there is a certain threshold of asking ourselves, you know, how are we respecting your time? Because you are being involved so much in the project.
I'd like to open the questions to the audience if there are any. Otherwise, we will. Any questions?
How does is it you found a way to put the wealth building into the community?
I think, Nadine, you started to speak about this in terms of the affordability and wanting to.
I mean, the value that the community had because of their culture. And now you come in and done the capital improvements, and they're going to have their small businesses prosper. But I mean, even more than that, can't they get like credits towards their taxes or something?
I think that's a really interesting provocation. Some
Right.
of right. Some of the models that I was talking about were like the real estate investment trust. There's also another model called the mixed income neighborhood trust. I'm not so familiar with it. We've also done like community investment funds where the longstanding residents basically are granted birthright shares. For that, we needed a philanthropic funder to support that, basically. But it is kind of complex legally. But I wonder, yeah, could there be some sort of citywide community compensation fund,
I think
right?
every community board should be given $20,000 and experiment on how that can be done associated with you.
That is certainly is a provocation. I was also thinking that the Bronx Heart is a community land trust, so
Yeah.
you purchased it.
Yeah, I mean, not yet, but they're processing, and also, I don't think it's, my lawyer friend tells me that it's not a real community land trust project because it's a lease from H&H. They're not handing over.
It's not ownership.
It's not
a long-term
ownership.
lease,
So,
but I see.
but the community land trust in general, the model is to have affordability forever, as they say. So that's what you get back. That's why, as I was asking you that question, because when you take long architectural processes that take, they started advocating for that building in 2015. That's 10 years. And construction is still not starting until next year, hopefully. And then, like, Kelsey can tell us more about those deadlines. March it is. So, that's why even as I tried to get people in the room, after a while, it's exhausting. But in the end, the reason they put in all this free time is because they think they will have an asset that will be forever affordable in their neighborhood. But yeah, the gains are really small. I think you're right that there should be something like the $20,000 to sit and ponder about things. You know, I hope the new mayor will do something new, because the directives that we all voted 2, 3, and 4 all takes the power away from the council people, right? And this is one powerful mechanism for the community land trusts that were successful. We're going through really, really strong community council women, such as Sandy Nurse in East New York. You know, she's really a force. So without that, you know, what is left for the community to express and get what they need? You know, what is the mechanism? What is the body? It's clearly not the, yeah. Anyway.
That's okay. I find it fascinating that the community centers, the parks and the gardens are more seen as a peninsula or as an island rather than as a microcosm for the greater health of the community very often. That you could look at how the schools are in the community, what the climate is in the businesses in the community, the social systems, but they are seen as something apart rather than something integrated into the body whole. I mean, it would be like an MOF5, which is a metal organic framework, just won the prize in Nobel Physics for
We'll look that one up.
I bring it up because it is a micro-architectural lattice, and 2 grams of that has the surface area of a football field. So the metaphor here is a community center, right, or community garden or park, despite its relatively small size or footprint, has a fairly massive, basically reach or footprint in the community as a whole, as an interactive body, as an organism.
Yeah.
Is that something that you all have sensed or feel?
Yeah, I felt that in their presentations, like when you speak about connective tissue and when you speak about interstitium.
That's why I brought that up, yes.
So we all learned something new here. We are at 8 o'clock, so we're going to have to start wrapping things up. I loved this presentation. I hope it was meaningful to you. There is work to be done. We have a new administration. We don't know where these things are going, but you mentioned 2, 3, 4, they passed, and Mandami voted for them.
Yeah.
So let's just wait and see. Okay, thank you all for coming.